Even some former Navy veterans are now starting to ask questions. If this is really appropriate to be charging the two captains of both the Fitzgerald and the McCain with negligent homicide for the actions regarding these two completely face non-accidents. They're not accidents. We've shown this here at the channel definitively. Charging these men with homicide argues directly in the face of what they've been telling us for the last 7 months. For the last 7 months, they've been telling us that the problems that led to these accidents were poor training and fatigue. If it's poor training and fatigue, how is it that all of the accidents just stopped last August? It is now what? Going to be February? September, October, November, December, January. 6 months. Nobody's gone overboard. No collisions. No events of any kind in the 7th Fleet whatsoever. Don't you find that strange, folks? That these accidents only occurred during a very specific time and period, and only in one fleet, and only aboard very specific kinds of vessels? You don't find that strange? You don't find it inappropriate that the man on the left here, the CEO of the Fitzgerald, he'd only been aboard for 30 days. How could you hold training issues accountable to that man? Even in their report, they say he left orders to be notified in certain cases of things, and that those orders weren't followed. I mean, what is he supposed to do? Wake up in the middle of the night? No. After having been aboard for 30 days? In the case of the man on the right, from the time a problem presented itself aboard the bridge with the steering to the time of the collision was less than 5 minutes, and in that time, 5 different people had hands-on attempting to rectify the issue. How is that not prepared? How is that not training? How is that not attention to detail? It's a bullshit story. This is the biggest bullshit story, and now they're going to try to put 2 guys in jail for 3 years while they let all of the people above them retire and take their golden parachutes. Even Admiral Swift himself stepped down after this. This is why the channel's here. We want justice and we want truth. And I'm going to continue to talk about this until we get it. Until somebody finally stands up and says, you know what? There's a lot of evidence for this being a bullshit story. And we need to go back over this. Now, even in this article, he talks about how the charges of negligent homicide are what they call esoteric and almost impossible to prove. And it also shows a whole bunch of other accidents as well. And my question would be this. If the charges of negligent homicide don't stick for either one of these two, are they going to go back through and charge all of these other former captains with attempted homicide? If it can be proven that there was a training or fatigue issue aboard their ships, that it was their responsibility to make sure the guys were trained and the guys weren't tired. And if that's the basis and the standard for negligent homicide, then clearly then there's a basis for attempted homicide. So, just something to think about. But here's where he talks about this. The Navy has never charged a ship's CO with negligent homicide. In fact, negligent homicide did not exist in the UCMJ until 1958. Further, the charge itself does not and has never existed in common law. In truth, negligent homicide is complex, esoteric, arcane, and difficult to prove. After all, there are very few who are genuinely equipped to determine whether those captains exhibited a lack of that degree of care of the safety of others, which a reasonably careful person would have exercised under the same or similar circumstance. Negligent homicide is a bridge which the Navy has been rightly loath to cross. Until now, and now they're going to do it twice, to maintain their fictitious false story. Now, when you look at this, we've established already in prior videos that this track, all the way up until this point, is the result of information transmitted to Vessel Finder from a Class B transponder, reporting every 5 seconds. Class A transponders, the ones that are required by law to be aboard vessels of this type, do not report in 5-second intervals. They report in 10-second intervals, and we see that here after the collision time. This is about 2:40 in the morning. 1740 GMT is 2:40 local. So this is a full hour and 10 minutes after the collision, and this is where allegedly now the ACX crystal has gone downrange 8 miles, turned around, came back. And this is where the changeover happens from the 5-second to the 10-second. Now, we've already covered the idea of where these attackers could have gotten their information, the issue with the electronics, the high-level Marines that got compromised in Bogota. But now we have to go down, what were they doing during this hour? Why did they need a story to say that, to cook up some false story about how they hit, they didn't know what was going on, they went down and came back, and that explains the hour difference between the time the accident allegedly occurred and the reporting event by both ships. What had to be going on during that hour? What did they need? Why did they need access to the Fitzgerald for an entire hour, having them be disabled, but also having nobody know about it for an hour until they came back? Because if the crystal was just there, it was a hit and run where they were just going to try to just clobber these guys and move on, they would have never come back, quote unquote. See, my allegation here is that the ACX crystal, the actual ACX crystal, never left the scene. And this is why I think that. Because remember, at this point, all of this final number here, up until this point, has always ended in a 2 or a 7, meaning that it's been reporting on the every 5-second. Now, here's where it changes. I'm going to play this forward. Okay, it comes down here. We've seen this. And it just sits there and sits there, reporting on the 2-second, reporting on the... And then it stops. And then it jumps to 10 seconds. See how it remains at a 7. Now it's reporting like a Class A transponder would report. But look at the difference here. Look at the change. Okay, now, switching over to the Class A, look at how close this vessel is to her actual original course. That Class B transponder might have very well been aboard a very small boat, running right underneath the ACX crystal, right in her wake or right alongside, so as not to attract attention. And then when it got up here, and it did this number over here, the Fitzgerald still thought that was the ship. Remember, in the report it said that they were tracking a vessel they thought to be the crystal, and they thought they were going to pass almost a mile, 1,500 yards away from it, and that's in the report. Yet then they hit her anyway. And then the captain of the crystal saying that the captain of the actual crystal, the real big container ship that was actually out there that hit them, saying that the Fitzgerald suddenly steamed onto her course, that it came out of nowhere, even though he said he saw it 10 minutes prior and attempted to not hit it 10 minutes prior, but then also said it suddenly steamed onto his course. This is where we know the guy's lying. And when you look at this, now look at the behavior of this vessel versus before. Okay, 3 knots, just kind of meandering around slowly, like you would expect a big ship to do. Not race down range 8 miles, do this giant U-turn. And as you can see, it's still moving 3, 4 knots, 3, 4 knots. Not 18 knots or 17 knots or something ridiculous. And still here reporting on the 10-second, just like a Class A would. You see, because here, at this point in time, they're expecting there to be rescue parties, and by this time there is. There's people on scene. The Japanese Coast Guard's here, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces here. Sorry about that. So they need to make it look like as if they were doing what they were supposed to do this whole time. But they needed access to the crystal for an hour. They needed there to be this 1 hour period with that ship disabled and nobody know that the ship is disabled and nobody on the way. Now here's where the story gets very, very strange. Remember the initial press conference where the Admiral O'Coin comes out less than 48 hours and does this press conference where 3 times in that press conference he states the 2:20 time. It happens at 2:20. Well, it was at 2:20. It was 2:20 in the morning. And we covered this in another video. They were trying to construct a narrative. They were trying to get you to believe something. Now, a matter of months later, remember this picture, we're going to come back to it. The first thing they put out was this supplemental report, this preliminary report. And all this report deals with is the events after the 1:30 time period. What they were trying to do here with this report was tell you what you were supposed to believe happened during that hour. They did not, in this report, even though they had the information, say what was going on prior to 1:30. They didn't talk about the course of the ship coming out of Sagami 1. All of that would have been a matter of the record. They would have had that day. They would have known. But this first report that came out 2 months later, when people were still kind of paying attention to it, talks only about what happened during that time. What the story they want you to believe happened during that time. Not about what happened before. The final report came out much, much, much later. And we described multiple errors in it. In fact, they had to pull it back and push it back out. So once we showed them, here at the channel, a bunch of errors. Timing errors and the like. But here's the funny part. This whole not calling for help thing. Let me show you something. Now you said, well, it was the water damage and that they couldn't call because the water came in and it damaged the radio room and all this stuff. Here's the part that is unbelievable. 2:23. Steering shifted from bridge to aft steering. 1MC ceases to operate. 2:40. Fitz reports loss of communications and loss of propulsion. I cannot speak today. At 2:40. An hour and 10 minutes later, reports loss of communications and loss of propulsions. To who? Fitz reports loss of communications and loss of propulsion. They didn't lose communications until an hour after the event. See, at this time, they still told everybody, and everybody still believed in this 2:20 time period. That's where we got that cooked up story about that kid with a WhatsApp call to his dad at 2:56, and how it was only 36 minutes later, when we now know clearly that can't have been, according to their report. He would have been not only, well, he would have perished, but there would have been absolutely no possible way that phone call could have occurred. So if they still had communications for an hour and 10 minutes after, why at 2:20 did somebody have to use a personal cell phone? 0200. Fitz makes initial report of collision at sea to CDS-15 via personal cell phone at approximately 2:20. 2:40. Fitz reports lots of communications. How in the hell does that make sense? But you see, no one was paying attention. And everybody wanted to cook up this story about poor training and about fatigue. And everyone was distracted. I'd say it, everyone was distracted by other stories that were in the news. And nobody covered this. And the strangest thing, and I'll leave it here, we're at about 15-minute mark. Very shortly after these incidents, the Navy announced, and you can go back to USNI and see this, that they were going to do something that they had never done before in the history of the Navy. They were going to take 3 entire carrier strike groups in the 7th Fleet and put them in joint operations. That is an incredibly, even their words were, complex maneuver. Even though they had just issued a report stating that there was a fleet-wide problem with operations and training and the knowledge of the crews and fatigue. Yet they schedule this giant maneuver they've never done before that requires incredibly complex and interconnected communications and operations. Would you do that? Would a reasonable person do that if they thought that particular fleet had that problem? So, anyway, 15 minutes. Something happened in this hour. Somebody had access to one of our destroyers for an entire hour with no communications, who was faking their transponder signal. Like, share, subscribe. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.